Hey everybody, this is Carlos Ocelot, founder and CEO of G2 Esports, former professional gamer, and wonderful bodybuilder, as you may have known. Of course, you know me for that, pretty sure. And you're watching Dancan's channel. Thorin, my man. Enjoy.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Daring Minds, the show that I do with Gio about Valorant. If you wonder, actually, I might just reveal it now. I always wait a few episodes in, so I want to see people try to guess or whatever. If people are wondering, why is it called Daring Minds? It's not because now that everyone's successfully run Sean Gares and fucking DDK out, the Minds game was available, and they had Immortal Minds, we're Daring Minds. Actually, wasn't that at all. Actually, what I did was, when I make names of shows, a little piece of info that people in the industry might be interested in, I actually understand SEO, so what I do is I search, has anyone else ever called any podcast this? Never mind just esports, any podcast. Has anyone ever named it that? I find a name that I try purposely to actually pick names that are neutral. Daring Minds means nothing until we do the show, and then we imbue it with what that would mean to you and what combo that would mean. And then finally, I just looked up synonyms to the word Valorant, and one of them was basically daring, so I just made it like that. See, it's not that hard, is it? But I'm sure the rest of you will just keep using whack names related to something in the game, like watch the spike or whatever the fuck. Yeah, listen, those are so fucking cliche. Come on. And also, do you understand SEO? You're never going to get anywhere near the top of that shit if you have 100 views on that video. You're just buried below every person talking about it. So if there's people are wondering, this isn't going to be another example where we have a guest here. It's not just me and Gio. There will be some more episodes like that, especially, by the way, if obviously no guests available. But we're trying to start out with a bunch of different guests. And one thing I'm trying to do as well, I like to just be transparent with people, is I'm trying to bring in different types of guests. So we had someone who was from the Overwatch world, and we had someone from the CS world, and they were more on the casting side. This is someone who was a coach. Peak basically worked for the Dallas Fuel in Overwatch League, and actually was very quick to switch over to Valorant. In fact, I was asking him about Valorant basically the first year the game was out, and he was telling me all interesting details, which we'll get into in a second. And in case people are wondering, don't worry, there are going to be some massive guests coming soon, but my style also, another little tip for the content creators out there, is make all the mistakes at the beginning when no one's watching. That's when you let it be scuffed. That's when you figure out, obviously I know fuck all about the game, do I? I want to actually know some stuff before I get the best player in the world on and start grilling him. I don't want to be going like I was in episode 2 or whatever, so you're an entry fragger, initiate, fuck, that's not what that role does. Shit, Thorin, shut up, you fucking it all up. I don't want to be that boomer. I want to actually have some sense of what I'm talking about. So this is going to be a bit more the experts angle. We're bringing them in, and then later on we'll have those big guests. So don't worry, some of them will be big. Some of them will be so fucking BIG, you'd think they would be killed in the 90s over some petty rap beef. Right, Peak, there's an intro you never thought you'd fucking get. Some sort of weird comparison to Notorious B.I.G. Peak, I want to ask you this question, mate. Basically, I want to actually start out by just asking, you don't have to remember it, obviously, but the gist of what I just implied there, one of the cool things we found on this show is, because Gio comes from Rainbow Six and Overwatch, and then I come from CSGO and League of Legends and StarCraft and Quake and Weird Games, and then someone like Dust came from CSGO to Valorant. All these, that's one of the cool things for me about Valorant. It actually reminds me of Overwatch, dude, where you have all these people coming from different games in a one, and the really cool thing about that is, you actually find out, it's like MMA, no one actually has the one game or the one background that is the god. Guess what? Even the people in TF2 had all that advantage early in Overwatch. They were so quickly taken over by Koreans who never played a bloody TF2 or any games like that. Some of them even came from Counter-Strike or whatever. So one thing I'm interested in is you gave me a very interesting take that you actually said you preferred Valorant to your original game Overwatch. And that is very rare, dude, because usually I find in esports, the game you initially work in and put your years into and you love, it tends to get cemented in your brain as the one, and then everyone after that you sort of chasing the dragon, but usually you don't get the same thrill. It's never quite the same. So why actually did you prefer Valorant to Overwatch? What was it you were enjoying about the game? So with Overwatch early on, it was basically if you remember when Overwatch League was announced, Monty was talking about how there's going to be playbooks and people are going to do set plays and all this and that and that. And then it turned into a clown fiesta every night, pretty much, when Overwatch League was on. There was always one team that was just doing basically nothing while still doing something and just running around. There's too much chaos all the time. And the game was designed to be fast and basically always keep you on the edge of the seat and always on. There's always a fight happening somewhere, yeah. Yeah, and I don't think that's as much of a focus on the esports part as it is on the consumer part. And it's more for, okay, I just came home from work, I want to escape. And then what's a better way to escape if there's never a downtime in the game, for example? And
they never really had these strategical parts as much as it was. Well, there was strategical parts, but there was way more about just adapting on the fly and analyzing stuff on the fly and having solid reactions, basically. And not as much, okay, we need to set this up here, go for this molly setup here, or, you know, you don't have the same depth. And instead, just a very shallow but wide base of foundation that you can make strats of. And that's why I prefer Valorant more, because in Valorant there's all these tools that you have at hand. For example, a main Cypher, and it's a very complicated agent, and you have several ways to problem solve. You have smokes that you can use to deny angles, and you can push them yourself. You can be a Stewie 2K, for example. You can have your tripwires and set them up to stop flanks. You can set them up to anchor. You can use your camera for audio. You can use your camera for visuals. And you can use your cages to place your camera. You can use your cages to... Yeah, that's just one example. And when you combine that with 4 other pieces and then against 5 enemies, I feel like my brain gets... what's a good example? I get that, like, reward, basically, is what I mean. Like, I get that reward.
It feels satisfying.
Like, yeah. This is something I can pour all my energy into this and still have stuff to think about. But in Overwatch, it felt like, okay, we've reached the limit, and now it's all about just min-maxing and just dealing with random stuff that will annoy us more than just the opponents will.
Right, okay. I can certainly see where you're coming from, by the way, because I would say, actually, the more I watched the different games, that was actually, I think, the slight flaw of Overwatch. Obviously, famously, it manifested in why it was so hard for people who were casuals to spectate, because the idea was there were multiple fights happening at all times, pretty much, and positions being assaulted, and you can only pick, like, one to focus on and narratively explain, and you can move between them, but it makes it very hard for the fan. And basically, the problem is, if people don't understand, it was as if you were having, like, a constant League of Legends team fight, and so you can't explain what, like, the backline guy's doing because you're too much looking on the foot guy, but, like, for the whole game. And so that's why, unfortunately, you had to kind of be a bit hardcore to appreciate Overwatch. I've played the game yourself, was the other thing I have to say. I think it was one of those games where if you hadn't played it was very hard, like League of Legends, funnily enough, to have even a clue what was happening. Whereas for me, like, I get your vibe, because that, to me, Overwatch, the way it actually ended up being played, was more akin to how, like, European soccer is played, which is it's more of like a free-form game with, like, loose overall strategical principles of how we're generally going to play, and then tweaks are things like just in the game, you know, watch for this. It's not like a set play, like you said, whereas obviously if you're coming from Counter-Strike, that's what Monty wanted. He wanted the American football, basically, where each down is like, right, now you execute this playbook thing, and then, you know, I'm looking to see what your play that you called is, and I'm going to call my counter play. He wanted it to be the chess match like that, whereas, yes, obviously I would agree, Overwatch, it might have had a few periods where it looked like you could do that, but by the end, and especially in the GOATs, mate, it was nothing like that whatsoever. It was more like, I don't know, fucking synchronized swimming or something by then. Who knows what that shit was. What do you think, Gio? You came from this game, so how do you contrast it?
Well, as to, like, whether or not I prefer Valorant, or
just what you think about, like, the angle,
I think, like that. The best way for me to put it is, like, there came a point where I realized that, like, Overwatch wasn't necessarily the game that I wanted it to be, if that kind of makes sense. I think that if you imagine, like, the ideal hypothetical way that Overwatch, like, you're handed all of the things that you have available to you in the game, the ideal way that could be would be so cool, but, like, naturally, you know, as Peak says, like, it becomes very chaotic. I mean, I am still very loud about the fact that I was a huge fan of the GOATs meta. I absolutely loved that era, and I know that's an incredibly controversial opinion. And for me, actually, the point at which I started to really turn away from Overwatch was when they brought in the role queue, because for me, like, what I thought was a massive asset to Overwatch was the inherent flexibility that you had to choose what permutation of composition that you want for those 6 people. And yeah, you could argue that does make it more chaotic, and it means that you have, you know, like, when you don't have the structure and limitation there, like, what does that lead you to? But for me, I thought that the option for creativity was something that I loved about Overwatch. One thing that I'm always very quick to admit is that Overwatch is actually the only esport I've worked in where I decided I wanted to work in the esport after already being a fan of the game for a significant period of time. So I came into Overwatch like being extremely familiar with the game, and so I never found it like hard to watch or hard to follow. And I think that when people would have these conversations about it not being very observer friendly and it not being very accessible, I can understand those conversations, but for me that was very opposite to my experience with it. So I think I enjoyed it as an esport a lot more than like the average person who's just coming to sniff around and see what it is, because I had been playing the game for such a long time before I got into it as an esport and was already very familiar with just watching the game and seeing how it played out. So that's the kind of an experience I haven't really had with other esports. Like even both Rainbow Six and Valorant, I played before I got into it as an esport, but like by that point, I was at a point in my career where when I was playing those games, I already had it in my head where I was like, maybe I want to work in this. Like maybe I want to look at it from this angle. I think, and this is something that I was thinking about the other day, actually. I think one thing that also really changes like the way that Valorant is approached, and this is maybe talking more from like a casual or like, you know, competitive role, competitive ladder kind of perspective rather than like a pro play kind of perspective. But one thing that kind of allows it to not fall quite as much into that chaotic mess that sometimes we saw Overwatch in is the fact that everyone has guns. Because like when you're just someone who is like an individual who wants to play a game, like you kind of want to be a playmaker to an extent. Like even if that's why we see people who like insta-lock DPS or whatever, and you know that was what it was in Overwatch, and it's insta-lock your duelist in Valorant or whatever. But everybody has the opportunity to be a playmaker in Valorant, while also bringing in those concepts of like using all of your utility and having that deep strategy and whatever. And I think that is something that can be unattractive to people in Overwatch, or a better way to put it is maybe people who played Overwatch played it quote unquote wrong, because like people would kind of play like heroes that don't necessarily like carry a massive gun around. They're not a Widowmaker, and so they want to try and make up for the fact that they don't have that available to them. And actually, like as dumb as that may sound,
it was quite famous, right? That if you played in the Q version of Overwatch, certain like characters that were played in Overwatch League, which never played in like solo queue, basically, right? Even though that's as a result, you weren't even playing the comps that the pros played, because, like you say, like it wasn't fun to play a certain like off tank or fucking some shit like that, right?
Right. I mean, off tank's like a good example, because like a lot of like off tank was a very supportive role. Like you could be aggressive in an off tank, but like the amount of peeling and stuff that you would have to do for your teammates to support your support line, you know, that's not something that you as like a rando who's just playing in solo queue is gonna want to fucking do. Like I don't give a shit about my support line. I want to get some kills, right? So like I think that's how people approach, you know, games. And in Valorant, while playing it quote unquote correctly requires more depth and more you know, pre-planned strategy or whatever, I think that as an individual just going into a solo queue, you can still get out of the game what like you might be looking for, while also being able to like use your utility to help facilitate the objective of what it is you're doing.
Yeah, fair point. By the way, I will say as well, I actually didn't think GOATs, I didn't dislike it totally. Like, I could actually appreciate, like, the strategical aspect, and I like watching the teams trying to execute the best. The problem I had was, it was just obvious it was going to kill the viewership, because the one thing you can always rely on in a game like that, in theory, is there's got to be, like, the DPS player, because that's the most casual, friendly role. Like, I'm sorry, you'll never convince me that it's better to watch Prophet on Zarya than on fucking Tracer. Like, it just isn't, is it? Like, there's one that he is Ronaldo on, and the other one, it's like watching Ronaldo in a wheelchair or something. Like, he can't do any of the fucking tricks, can he? Like, he's fucked in that scenario. So listen, it's one of those ones where, like, you have to understand, Monty also low-key thinks GOATs was the absolute best, but it's like, Monty, you're never going to sell this to the fans, dude. Like, they're not enjoying it the way you are.
I think the reason I love GOATs so much is because I was a color caster, and it was fun to color cast GOATs, and that's probably why Monty liked it as well, because he's in the same fucking position.
And it gives you some room to actually talk about the game, whereas, when it was just pure DPS, it was just like, why can you, like, the joke is, it is just everyone going rap god, isn't it? That's all. It was all just the play-by-play, fucking
like,
going
dive
ham.
meta was boring to color cast.
Exactly.
It was great for play-by-plays, but like, that's not me.
Absolutely. Right, so one thing we're going to do is, also on this show, I'm still getting a feel for like what the boundaries of discussion within Valorant are. Spoiler, I think we've already on some of the first shows actually broached topics I never see bloody discussed on the other shows. Because too many of the other shows, for my money, are just like, it's like here's the update since last episode. It's like, they think they're doing like a soap opera or something, so it's just literally the everyday, like, this match happened, this player joined. Like, I like those convos, but I like them to potentially lead to something bigger. So we're going to start out with some very topical stuff. So obviously on the last episode when we had Dust, we did talk about the VCT NA challenges and we looked at the matchups, etc. Now, yes, I understand, because initially I hadn't gotten the protocols down so I could release on the same day, because we released like 3 days later. Yes, we all know it's hilarious that Geo and Dust were all like, there's no world where Luminosity wins this game. Version 1 are the best thing. Cloud9 is number 1. Yeah, we get all that. We get it. And we looked silly. Yes, I know that they'd all lost by the time we put the episode out and it all looked like, ha, 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 ha. But if anything, by the way, I actually think that is what you should do in analysis. If you really do think a team is better, you should say it. Because now when we talk about it now, Geo, we can use that context
Like, let's be honest, anybody who prior to the playoffs thought that Luminosity was going to be version 1 is a fucking liar. Like, you can make fun of the fact that we thought that Luminosity would lose to V1, but I still stand by that. I would have made that prediction again tomorrow if like, you know, I didn't know that it had happened. So,
So let's contrast it based on that.
Luminosity were going to be V1.
Exactly. So that actually highlights and emphasizes what a massive upset it was. So let's start with that. Like, how did this happen, Gio? Because obviously V1 was the team. Like, you had, like, I think V1 was second after Cloud9 in your little mini power ranking, right?
So there were some things about that game which I thought were really impressive from Luminosity. Like, 2 big things. A, Luminosity were doing really well in their pistol rounds, and then the follow-up round as well. Their anti-ecos were very good as well. And obviously in any, I'm sure it's the same in Counter-Strike, but like in any game where you've got an economy, to do well in those rounds is going to give you a really big
it's a massive
boost,
swing factor,
especially if you can get it on both sides, right? Like attack and defense. So I thought Luminosity were doing great in their pistols. I also think, like, if you want to look at individual players, B-Dog popped the fuck off. Holy shit. He absolutely went wild in that game. And there was also some really nice tech used by him, particularly I'm thinking, like, there was a round in their bind game where he was playing chamber, and on the B site there's like a little cubby that usually gets cleared out by some kind of Molotov, especially if attackers want to be coming in through hookah and or through garden, like B long, and so they just need that angle to be cleared. And he was hiding in that little cubby. A snakebite comes in, tries to clear him out. Now what usually happens, of course, is the player has to step out into the open and force themselves into the line of sight, but because he's playing chamber, he just puts his teleport right down at his feet, fucks off out of there without anyone knowing that he was there or risking himself. And I thought, like, that obviously a play in and of itself isn't going to win a game, but it's just little pieces of tech like that I thought was really cool. Luminosity is a team who I did mention in the last episode, in the first week, or week 5 or whatever it was, when NA started playing on the new patch, LG was one of these teams that, like, really lent into, okay, right, we're in a new patch, like, let's just, like, full go at this new patch. We're just going to full send it. We're not going to bother hanging around with, like, Viper, Astra, whatever. And it didn't necessarily work out, like, to the way they wanted when they were playing against XSET. Like, they didn't win that series, but they were very willing to go for those kinds of ideas. And it was the same thing in this game against version 1. Again, on this bind game, they didn't bring a Viper, and that was something that Sideshow, particularly on the broadcast, was, I don't want to say critical of, but he was skeptical. Like, in the pre-game analysis, he was like, this is weird. Like, this is not necessarily what we'd expect to see. And I agree. I think on bind, that's a big risk to take. But the fact that they're really leaning into these new ideas and fully, like, going for that, I think is a really big asset to Luminosity.
You pick, Peak. Which side of this do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about Luminosity? Do you talk about version 1? You hit me with it. What are you interested in?
I want to talk about both, because, like, on Bind, for example, you could see that Luminosity, they had a Brimstone, but not the Omen that's more popular now, where you run Omen plus Brimstone so that you have the controlling smokes, but also fast execute. And instead, they had a Sova, I believe. And when you skip the Viper, for example, you don't aim to play for this, like, you don't bait out utility, you don't bait out the flashes or the drone or dog and so on. And I think that's one of the key things for Luminosity, but also that they won the pistol rounds and the buy round after the pistol, because doing that on attack is already 2 rounds. And then when you switch over to defense, you need 4 rounds at a minimum to have a really solid economy, and then getting the pistol round, by round, bonus round on defense, you're setting yourself up for mega success. And you have the tempo, the tools for tempo plays with Brimstone, with the Sova and Raze, and especially Chamber as well, where you can use the teleporter to go aggressively and then teleport out. And we've seen teams like OpTic even do that. And I can bring that up later. But then if we go for Fracture, we could see that version 1, they had an Astra, and Astra was nerfed, right? But LG or Luminosity, they're sitting there with the Omen only, and no real fast execute instead. So they have, I've got the page up here, they had Jet, KO, Killjoy, Omen, and Sova. And to me, I feel like a lot of these compositions where they have Omen plus Killjoy plus KO and Sova, well, Sova comes in general now in NA, they kind of copy each other a lot. And it's like all the NA teams are kind of handicapped without the Sova for gathering info. But because once you have the Omen, smokes are too slow to enter in. You need to basically use everything all at once, flashes, you need to smoke, and even then you still struggle. And at that point, there's no difference between using Omen to entry and everyone else compared to just Jet smoking, dashing into smoke, and then everyone comes in after. And they should have probably thought about using Brimstone over Omen there and had even more success. But then they also run the risk of losing mid control, or just not making the enemies think where you are, basically, or have to worry about where you are. So I feel like Luminosity, if they would have a stronger execute, they would have rolled over version 1 in Ascent as well, and it would have been a 2-0.
Were you implying, by the way, sorry, just as a quick follow-up, were you implying that like the idea is that the version 1 were sort of like stuck in the old meta and they hadn't been as sort of embracing of like what the best agents are now? Is that what you were trying to sort of imply with the composition comparison?
Yeah, well, yeah, they were as old in the old meta, but they still won the game, and I think they won it because of just being used to the old meta, and right. You just adapt a bit different and factor in the changes. But Luminosity, they didn't really have the same power, if that makes sense, because they have a new composition. You add in the creativity, but also the plays that kind of don't really make sense versus that Astra, and I feel like they didn't have the same power spikes, and that's why they ended up losing there. And good by version 1 to be in the old meta, but eventually you're gonna hit a roadblock where that doesn't really work anymore.
Okay. I think personally, like when we're talking about Ascent, which is the second map that you're talking about where version 1 actually won, the real big difference that stood out to me that allowed version 1 to get ahead in that game was actually the Xel'Sys versus Martyr on the KOs, because I know I've been a bit critical of Martyr on KO in the past anyway, but I think Xel'Sys, particularly when version 1 were playing on defense, a lot of his utility was really, really good at holding back a lot of LG's engages. And I mean, even just when you look at like how and when he would use his fragments to cut off something like A main or B main or whatever, like it would actually have quite a significant interruption to what it was that LG were planning to do. But there were even other little plays by Xel'Sys that were just really nice. I mean, on I've literally got it written down, but round number 18 is the one where version 1 used their Cosmic Divide to try and get a retake on the side, and it wasn't like the Cosmic Divide in and of itself that won that for them, because Luminosity were perfectly happy to push through the Cosmic Divide to try and get a kill onto the player who's doing the defuse. But actually where Xel'Sys is positioned right next to that player with his gun up, because they know that Luminosity are going to push through, and he gets 2 kills for that and completely denies them the opportunity to deny that defuse. It's stuff like that that I thought was just really nice from version 1, and just like very notably Xel'Sys in particular, who was doing a really good job on that map.
Fair enough. Right, what about, obviously version 1 is still alive, but their issue is they now play the match where, if people go back to that episode, the 2 teams we had getting out of the bracket were Cloud9 and V1, and spoiler, one of them is going to go out in second to last place. So what about this matchup? Because it gives us a chance now. We talked a bit about version 1, maybe do the Cloud9 side, right? As far as I can tell, Peak, a lot of other people had a similar opinion to Geo. Like, Cloud9 looked like the best team at that point in time going into that matchup. So how did they end up in this scenario, and do they prevail against version 1?
I don't think they will. I think they will be easy to scout because from what I've seen when, especially Cloud9 faced OpTic, Cloud9, they rotated between, I'll take Haven as an example. They rotated between having the Omen, the one with, well, yeah, you just send out the smokes from a long range and then have him lurk basically on C long or something. And you have Killjoy set up a turret in mid and then pushes where the turret is going to look. Like, they kind of overlap their own utility and they are redundant to a big extent. And it's very easy to stop that. So if version 1 scouts them and just sees, okay, they are not really efficient here. And I forgot even to mention what they rotated between, but to the other part. But the other part is where they have everyone walking together except Killjoy, and it's basically a ranked strategy, it feels like. So for me, it feels like it's super easy to just look at that. Okay, if we find the Omen, we know that if Killjoy is lurking and we don't hear Omen steps or we don't even see any Omen, then he's going to be lurking as well somewhere. And usually he's on the edges of the map, and then he makes his calls. Like I believe what's the name? Vanity. He's the in-game leader, right? So
yes,
as far as I understand, they don't have a shared role. And when he goes for those positions on the side, I guess he's using it as leeway to think a bit more, because there's no point in lurking as Omen there. And you can set up your stuff as Killjoy, use her as a sentinel. So if you get alerted that someone is coming on C long, you can be in mid, keep control there, and now you can tell your teammates who are maybe over at A or maybe over at mid, okay, someone is coming here, let's do this. And you don't have to basically remove one body and leave it up to chance or leave it up to duels where, okay, this one guy is going to face, we have a 3v3 or 3v4 or something and losing the fight, and then you have to run in with utility you don't have anymore, or maybe the Omen is too late on the smokes, or whatever. You don't have the flash as well when you play him there. And if, version 1, I can't repeat what I'm saying here, but if version 1 just watch the match versus OpTic, they can stop them completely, and I feel like they can. And
because the game plan is sort of seen the blueprint of how you beat them.
Yeah, I feel like the players in version 1 are kind of high energy, and they are the sort of players that will go above and beyond of just, okay, let's think inside of the box here, and they will come up with these weird ideas, or we can stop this, or we can do this like tiny thing here. And
okay,
I feel like when you're an old team especially, you kind of disregard that type of thinking. You kind of set in your way, and that's something that bothered Cloud9 in Champions, for example, where they just had so much focus on dueling and so much focus on the duelists, and not really as much focus on the team combos and how you position with all the roles in the map.
Okay.
So I
think one of the things that I would find concerning if I were Cloud9 is the fact that in the game against OpTic, Cloud9 and OpTic swap maps. So like Cloud9 took OpTic's map, OpTic took Cloud9's map. And I think that if you come into a series, and now you could argue, of course, Cloud9 actually lost their map not as egregiously as OpTic lost their map. So there is that to consider. But I think that if you go into a series knowing that the maps that you have chosen and that you are ostensibly really strong on, actually you couldn't hold your own on, that's a little bit concerning, especially as undoubtedly version 1 are going to ban Breeze, right? I think, that's what OpTic did. Everyone knows that Cloud9 are really good on Breeze. And I think that it would be a really smart idea from version 1 to follow in those footsteps to deny that to Cloud9, because I think that would likely be a win for C9 on that map. But on Haven, which was Cloud9's map pick against OpTic, it went into overtime, only one overtime. But like the thing that I find also a little bit of a concern about that map is that this was a map that when OpTic played against version 1 on it, that was when OpTic first brought this neon strategy that got countered by version 1 and actually didn't end up working. And this was a conversation that we actually had on one of the episodes we did here, was, are OpTic going to bring that back and like make some adaptations to it, or are they just kind of going to leave it? And the answer was they did bring it back. They brought it back for this series against Cloud9, and they did make adaptations to it. Now, if Cloud9 struggled against that composition, which version 1 were able to successfully counter when OpTic brought it out the first time, that's another layer of concern that I have. I think the other thing as well is you have to consider that throughout the course of this series, like, the two players who were doing really well consistently were Leaf and Zephyr. And that's not a bad thing, but I'm always think it's good to have a healthy dose of skepticism when the best performing players in your team are always the duelists, because I think that sometimes that can be indicative of there not being enough done on like the support end of the team, which arguably is the most important part of whether the team is going to succeed, at least in this era of Valorant, where like setups and how you use your utility is super important. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm like super like low on Cloud9. I mean, I'm such a huge fan of this team, but they didn't do as well against OpTic as I expected them to. And I think that, yeah, like that combined with what Peak was saying just about potentially those blueprints have been laid out and they can be read into, especially with, you know, Vanity on you know, kind of new agents. I think that as an individual, he made some good individual plays on Omen, but that doesn't mean that they were as good as they could have been for the rest of the team. And that's potentially worrying.
Yeah, if you take someone like FNS, for example, he's the one shot calling for OpTic. The guy top frags when he's playing on Cypher, and you need to have a massive multitasking.
Popped off that series, like he was actually on something. on Ascent, FNS went wild. Yeah,
I mean, he has been like that consistently since he joined Envy, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoy watching him, because he has this like very logical way of playing, and it's sort of like a software engineer when he's playing, well, when he's thinking, I guess. And that paired with the gun mechanics and the positioning and the movement, that's what you want from Vanity as well. But I think maybe your like a lot of the what's it called, compensation happens on the duelist end, I feel like, for Cloud9. And NA, for example, they used to rely a lot on the duelist. Like, for example, OpTics, they still do sometimes. They have Ye going on these very greedy angles with a chamber, and they don't have to do that. Like, they can get solid wins, but I guess that's also a type of... it depends on the culture of the team and the attitude of the players and so on. But yeah, if you're Cloud9 and you would happen to see, okay, I don't need to do all the thinking in game, and you can prepare like lots of thinking. Well, maybe Vanity does, but your prep work is the issue. If the time spent thinking in game takes over and kind of lose the mechanics and so on, because I don't think it's that difficult to adapt to the in-game leader role, but also have the mechanics, because if you're efficient, you don't need to do that much thinking, and you just autopilot pretty much the talking, the plans and so on. And yeah, I don't know where I wanted to go with that, but I think that's the difference, at least between the two teams, and why OpTic lost and why version 1 can figure out Cloud9.
I think that right now, like, obviously this conversation about like where the value from the controllers is coming is really prevalent, just because people are using new controllers. Some teams are deciding that they want to go with Omen more, some teams are going with Brim more. And I think that even though it isn't a direct IGL versus IGL comparison from Cloud9 versus OpTic, because obviously their IGLs are on different roles, I think that it is really important, if we look at the Ascent, which was the third map in that series, compare the performance of Vanity and the performance of Marved. Marved on the Brimstone had an excellent game, and it felt like he was always getting value round over round, and he was also doing a really good job of individually shutting down some of those most valuable players from Cloud9. So like Zeppa, for example, would make an engage into the A site on Ascen, and he would use a null command, the team would shoot him, so like he's down, and then they use this orbital strike so that he couldn't be rezzed. And it's like really good, like sublime usage of the new control, and not that an orbital strike is new, but like of these now meta controllers utility that Marv was doing a great job of. That, yeah, it felt, I think it's fair to say it felt like there wasn't as much that we could say about Vanity along the same arm. I also think that in the last two maps of that series, you could start to see like Cloud9 getting a little bit uncomfortable. And for me, like where that really manifested itself, and I'm curious to know, Peak, if this was something you noticed as well, but it felt like a lot, especially on their defenses, they would have really aggressive defenses. Like, for example, on Fracture, they had like kind of a neat little setup down in like A hall where there were like 3 of the players. But the problem is a lot of the attackers were set up to come down through dish and drop. They take the entire site together, and then the defenders just kind of keep pushing A hole, and it felt like sometimes, and on Ascent there were like similar like B main pushes at times where it almost felt like they were just chasing that opening kill. Like they wanted something, so they would keep pushing defensively and sort of get a little bit too far in that. And for me, like that felt kind of strange to watch, because I feel like throughout the course of the stage and the Cloud9 that we know, like the post Vanity Cloud9, like they always seem to look like they have a lot of control over their decision making, and they always seem to look fairly composed. And this was like one time where I just noticed these plays every now and then where I was thinking like, this doesn't always look super composed. Like it does look a little bit like they're uncomfortable and a tad kind of desperate to just claw that back. And I think that the pressure of being down in the lower bracket, going against the team that, let's be honest, most people thought was going to be the grand final matchup. I certainly did, V1 versus Cloud9. And this is their last opportunity. Otherwise, they're not making Masters. Like, how are they going to deal with that pressure if we can already see some of the lack of composure in the game against OpTic?
Well, I feel like this is it's typical for, I feel like it's typical for any teams, but also for EU teams, of course, mainly for these teams that are kind of newer or more. Not in the same, I don't compare them to this, but like mismanaged teams, for example, where you have a team that doesn't really know what to do, and they have no way to like funnel down, like imagine like a ton of information coming in, and you have like a funnel. That's like for a good team, they have like funnel, and they have like a tube that the information just goes through, forced in there, and then you sort it out. But when you're C9, for example, in the third map, you try to kind of sorry, I was going on a different tangent there, but you kind of try to set the tone for the match, and you try to dominate the other team, and you try to get into their head, and you do things that you don't need to. I feel like that's just, well, they have experience, but it comes with inexperience. Like you don't have the same type of tone to the teams that have played, for example, 2 years together, or in other games where you're like a rookie player. You're kind of aggressive, you take risk, you go greedy plays, you do things that you don't really have to. And then if we take Stu 2K, for example, he's a perfect example, doing all these things, and then later on, super strict, super composed, not really risking things because you don't have to. And that's something that they haven't done yet. They haven't grown into that. And I think it's because they're young, and especially because of how the NA culture in Valorant is. Like, it's a very celebrity oriented, where you don't really see the same type of mindset as Gambit or let's say Ascend, where you have more, how do you call it, logical type of looking at it, and not really impulsive and emotional way of looking at it. And I think that's what they really try to do. They try to just, let's get them, let's show them basically who we are, and then it didn't really work out.
What about then, since you were talking about OpTic, what about if we segue this? By the way, as an aside, I'm actually very surprised to find out fucking FNS is popping off. He was actually one of the worst fragging in-game leaders we had in 1.6. But I will say he was a good leader. I actually, if people don't know, I actually recommended him, and he actually got picked up by Cloud9 in CSGO, but sadly, fucking Tarek was in the team, so he had him cut like 2 months later. All I'm saying is, Jack, maybe listen to me over Tarek. I actually have a brain and can talk. Right, here's the question though, is since we already talked a little bit about Optic, and obviously now they are actually in a prime position to potentially take one of these 2 spots, how do you actually envision that? Do you think they end up getting one of the 2 spots for the Masters?
I think so.
Let's
Oh,
see the
yeah, go.
they're going to be playing the guard. Oh, sorry, I just wanted to see the bracket because I didn't remember who it was they were playing next. I think that Optic now have probably moved into one of my favorite spots, like for taking it. The guard could beat them. I think that they will beat the guard, but like, I mean, who fucking knows? I don't know what I know anymore, given how my predictions went before the playoffs. But Optic did look very good in that game against C9, and at this point, I think I would be surprised if they didn't make it to the grand final of the playoffs.
By the way, as an aside, I don't ever care if anyone, like, it's all fun and games for banter, but I don't actually care if people get predictions right. I care more about what the reasons why they made the prediction was. Like,
I'm just making fun of myself.
Yeah, of course. You can obviously get the result wrong and have like a totally spot on analysis. Like maybe they just didn't play that way. That happens sometimes. What do you think, Peak? Would you have Optic as one of your 2 teams getting out?
I think it depends, because when I watch the guard, it feels like it's very similar to how Gladiators played in Overwatch and how they kind of structure their whole way of practicing the game. You have the like you're taking VOD reviews, for example, in a specific way. You look, okay, they do this and this and that, and they stop here, us here, and it's very similar to how I would say like if statements in programming is or
like a flow chart.
Yeah, flow chart type of a way. That's what it feels like, and I'm not sure if it is, but that's how Gladiators were, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's the same, ownership kind of transferring it a bit, because it was a working formula for them there. And if Optic has realized that, which they probably have, they can notice, okay, the guard have been hyped up. Everyone has been trying to take down the Kingmaker, or the King, I guess. I don't know if that's the right term, but yeah, it doesn't matter. And there's been a lot of samples of how other teams have tried to counter them or have tried to copy their own strats or their strats. In EU, for example, G2 did it versus Liquid, and then other teams have done it in NA. And you can kind of manufacture counter strats fairly easy. And it feels like Optic has the personnel for it to carry out these counter strats, and also the calm mind for it, especially with FNS being the leader. And I feel like they will be able to take it because of the countering strats.
Okay. By the way, just as an aside, because obviously you do come from Overwatch, I want to get your take on Zyra player, because this is a player where I talked about, I think, on the first episode when we were just briefly addressing some of the players. Like, I used to think this guy was a fucking stud on Widowmaker, and if people don't know, he used to play for one of the worst teams, and he legit had to just like 1v9, be like 1v12 or something Overwatch, but he had to like fucking 1v11 the whole game, felt like. What have you thought of him in Valorant, Peak? It seems like it's like finally he's sort of getting his shine now, like he's coming into his own in this game, right?
I remember the first time I scrimmed against him and like players like Munchkin, for example, it was like, it's like you normally see like this slow train go past you, and then these guys come in, it's like the world's fastest train just zooming past you or like hitting you even, and you don't even see it coming, and you don't, like when you're watching, it doesn't feel the same as when you're playing against them, because it is like a mental hit, like a wake-up alarm. And I think that in Valorant, they have been able to shine because you have the ability to carry games alone to a much greater extent than in Overwatch, because in Overwatch, sure, the guy was 1v11 all the time, and he was underpaid. He was not really worked around, not played, like he was even...
It's like they just left him to his own, because if people don't know, they didn't have that many Koreans in this team. So it's almost like he just played on his own and they did whatever, didn't they?
Yeah, it's like when you have a job that you don't like doing, but you have to do the job. That's the type of look he had. And I feel like he is only improved, and he has only been better. And if he's finally getting the recognition, but he's going to get way more, I feel like.
For sure. Yeah. Well, what about this then? Obviously, like it is just basically the whole theme, because spoiler, as usual, Reddit is just fucking mainly NA people. So there's always a shift on Reddit in every game to caring more about NA teams. And then within NA, what does NA secretly care about the most? Oh, it's tactics start. No, it isn't. It's drama. We all know that. So as a result, every episode, we're now coming to like play the theme tune. It's the Sentinels part of the fucking show, because it has to be discussed every bloody episode, because they're just like all the nicknames, all the drama. But crucially now, they can't even say was doing it for views because they actually have fucking got out last place of the whole thing. And here's the problem I have with the Sentinels topic, right? Is you can see in their players before these key moments where sort of reality itself slaps them in the face and says, no, you're actually not good anymore. They always seem to have that thing that actually people who were the best in the past always have, which is you just think people are hating on you when you actually are sliding down and you're sort of in denial for a while. And then obviously now there's this whole drama still with like, are they even going to get a coach? When are they going to get a coach? Like, but how many of these are you going to go through? So at this point in time, like they're obviously in the rock bottom position. This is in theory where you would expect something's going to change, right? So, right, Gio, what are your initial thoughts now? Like, it's pretty shocking, right? They'd come in last place. There's one thing to not make the spot. Like, you know, this is a terrible performance overall.
Yeah, so I didn't get to see either of the Sentinels games. So
That's
yeah,
fine.
I was on a different broadcast this weekend. But like I heard that there was one map where tens really popped off or something. I think it was on the it was Vine. Oh wait, this was not the one against version 1 then? Was this the first one they played?
Let me see.
Against the God? But so yeah, I heard that there was one map where like tens like really popped off and everyone on social media was like, oh my god, he's back. And then like the next thing I hear is like, oh shit, Sentinels are actually not in the competition anymore. I honestly like the boring answer is I don't think I have anything more to say about Sentinels than I've already said. Like I whenever people ask me in my Twitch chat, they're like, what do you think Sentinels should do? I always reply the same thing. I'm like, they need a structured support staff situation first. Like, in my opinion, they haven't had that enough for me to be able to tell you as like a third party whether or not I think the roster needs to change. But so my opinion is like, I want to see what they do with like a solid coach situation. If it's still a dumpster fire, then they've got to change shit. Now, obviously, there is that pressure of like, okay, well, they haven't qualified and they still need to go through the rest of the year and they want to be, the org wants to find success. You know, it's not a franchise system, so like there's a lot more pressure on the organizations. So do they just kind of like decide to change things up in the roster? And like I wouldn't be surprised if that is a route that they tried to take, but personally I would prefer to see a coach come in first. I actually don't know / remember what the deal is. Like they qualify for playoffs, so my preference would be, at the very least, that they get a buy-in to the closed qualifiers for next stage. I don't remember what. Yeah, I don't remember what it actually is because, like, I assume that they're not going to get an invite straight into the stage like they had in for this one. But
I think it would back to step one.
I think it would be very unfair for them to go like to the round of 128 or whatever it is, like in the open quals. I think that would be not fair. But like, I think it's still going to be like tough for them. Like I definitely want to see them have some support staff come in before they have to start qualifying for stage 2. And yes, this was a huge loss for them to be first rounded.
Now, the interesting thing is, I will remember this, put this in the description box, because PK actually had a Twitter thread about the Sentinels' loss where he essentially explained what he sees as like I think it's essentially the stylistic and the approach-based problems they have in the team, actually, which is essentially, you thought that like the brief gist was, you thought that essentially they play sort of like too much burden of execution on their tactics. And as a result, if like one part sort of fails, the whole thing collapses in. And then I noticed also, it sounded like you thought there wasn't a very good synergy between tens and zombs, and essentially like sometimes they were sort of doing redundant things, like tens takes an area over, but because they didn't coordinate, they essentially lose the area. Therefore, the next player that comes in has to retake that area using utility, etc. Is this the gist of like where we're starting here, Peak?
Just want to correct it. It was the version 1 that Geotech was. Okay. But also about the tweet, it was like tens and zombs. It's like they were in sync to move in. And they basically, okay, we go in. And I don't think it was the right, like they did weird calls because Tens got naded and then he goes in. But at the same time, okay, if he goes in, we have to go in because then everything is just screwed. Like everything falls down if he's dead. Or we have to re-clear where he clears and so on. So he pushes in. But if Zombs dies because he's alone, he's pushing in bathroom and bind, then bam, that part dies as well, and then you have to clear that area. And it's the rest of the squad. It's Shazam, it's Sick, and Dapper that are kind of in the back. They're kind of leaning back in their chair and, you know, looking at the game. And then, oh, wait, we got to go in. Now they go in. And it's sort of they have two different ideas of how to react. And that usually happens when teams don't scrim together long enough, or they take too long off a break, or they play more ranked than they actually scrim, or they just do like when they don't have the hive mind is what I mean. And I feel like that's a style they don't fit in. Like they have this free-flowing style. They have creative players. They have Tenzu who's really good on the fly. You have Dapper is good on the fly. You have Zoms who's good on the fly. Shazam on the fly. Like, why do they go for these tailored strats that basically a team who copies others would go for? And it doesn't make sense because it does make sense to me, but I'll get to that in a second. Instead, like when you at first sight, it doesn't make sense because, okay, these are so good players. Like, why would they do this? Like, is it just luck, randomness? And they themselves probably feel like, okay, this is randomness, a random death here because I was looking at this corner, or a random.
Just unlucky, basically, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how you basically live in the bubble. You don't exit the comfort zone, and especially.
I'll give you a quick aside. Basically, the most classic. Like annoying aspect if you talk to pro Counter-Strike players is the ones that are like you're talking about, the ones that are like skillful players, but they're kind of used to just playing off their like impulse and their instinct. What they'll do is when you point out a strategical mistake they made, or even like a specific micro tactical error, they will just say something like, I just got unlucky, I missed the shot, or he hit a bullshit headshot. So like essentially, like you're saying, they're stuck in a bubble where like they're almost taking like what they see as random inputs as to what changed the output. But actually what you're trying to say to them is your whole vision of what you were trying to accomplish was essentially maybe too simplistic, or
and, like,
in this case too complicated.
Themselves of accountability.
Yeah, they just think that like, oh, it would have worked, or it should have worked in a scrim. So it's like a way to not accept the reality of the result, basically. Yeah. Well, keep going anyway, mate.
Yeah, so when they do that type of like living in the bubble, there's no way to correct them, especially when there's no coach, and it's detrimental to them. Like they will fail if they keep on just pushing away these natural corrections, which is feedback from all the analysts, all the fans, the reaction to strats, losing matches, and so on. And it tells me that, okay, there's no one in the organization or in the team that has either the balls or the power to tell them, okay, this is what's going wrong. You should maybe try and think about this. Like, instead of eating yourself into death one by one, why don't you create some strategy instead where all the pieces are being used at the same time instead of one by one?
Yes.
And it feels like they probably do tailor this to be very what's it called, error prone or perfect, if that makes sense. Perfect, because you can't do any fails, or you don't have any room for error, because maybe that's their vision of what perfect looks like. But then they also forget that, okay, there's no coach that can drill this. There's no coach who can see, okay, is this actually good for us? Probably not. It's sort of like being a singer in the shower and then trying to go to Eurovision or something. Like, it doesn't really work. And no matter if you like it, match results will tell you, okay, that didn't work. And what they could do instead is put yourself. Well, what I would do instead is pick a strategy that's a bit less perfect in your eyes, and go with more room for error, because then you can be more flexible on the fly and lean into your strength of, okay, adapt on the fly. You don't really need the perfect plan right in the moment before the fight, and just do whatever feels natural to you, because that's what they do in rank, that's what they do in practice probably, and that's what they've been doing in matches up to now.
I will say, by the way, a concept that comes, it's actually primarily espoused in League of Legends, believe it or not. It took many years before people understood this competitively, but the principle is, we describe it like this: it's better for all 5 players to do the wrong tactic than it is for all 5 to do a bunch of different tactics. So even if out of the 5, 2 of them actually like are the smarter ones and they've made the right read, theirs isn't going to work either because the other 3 aren't doing it. So essentially the premise goes in those games, that's also why you want a good shot calling setup, because it's not that every time the shot caller makes the right call, but it's that we all agree to do what he says, and in doing so, at least it gives it a chance of working. And also, you then know, here's the key thing, it sounds to me like the Sentinels fall down on peak. They won't even know if it's working, if they're disjointed and people are going in at different pacings and timings and doing things that they won't even actually know if their original plan was correct, because they didn't essentially all do it correctly. So at that point in time, you are going to blame silly things like, oh, you were just a second behind, or he just headshot me randomly. Like, you're going to blame silly things that aren't really the cause macro wise of why you're losing. What do you think anyway, Gio?
I I think that it's...
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. So one more thing to that. It feels like they don't trust coaches, like to bring in a coach, like they kind of are above some coaches, it feels like. And I experienced that myself in Overwatch a lot of times where pro players are gonna, nah, you're the coach, we're gonna step on you, we're gonna sweep you under the dirty rug instead. And what, like, even if they don't want a certain coach, hire like 2 people to be your VOD monkeys and just like watch VODs over and over and over and like extract all the information that you otherwise don't have time for, and then you work with that. And that's one way they actually could figure out that. But yeah, I didn't mean to take over too much.
That's all right. Yeah.
No. So I was going to say, just like on the first one, I think that it's a very good point that like good teams are teams that can have contingency, right? So like, and I think like usually the strongest teams we see are the ones where something goes wrong or it doesn't go to plan or whatever, and then they have a really good comeback from that. And actually that's something that I think that OpTic in their game against Cloud9 did really well, just as an example. And so yeah, if like your entire sort of strategy, you know, per se is that you have this really like idealized idea of how it's going to go, and you're going to do this, and you're not necessarily planning for what then happens if like those things get counted, because like you can't like precisely assume where the enemy is going to be, what the enemy is going to be doing, because if you could do that, then you would never lose a game, right? So to go in without much of a contingency is I think probably, yeah, a sign of a slightly weaker team. Also on the topic of like a lot of pride amongst like players, obviously me having never been a coach, like I don't have direct personal like experience with that peak, but it's something that I can definitely imagine, like especially when I just think back on my own experience, like growing up, like being a human being, I've always been someone who is a very proud person and is very bad at taking negative feedback. Like when I was in school, a very academic person, like that kind of shit was really hard, and I totally would have been the kind of like in my late teens, early 20s, the kind of person who would like kind of sweep that under the rug because it hurt my pride too much. It would have hurt my ego too much. And that's definitely something that's very hard to overcome. Like I've worked very hard in my 20s to be able to be more humble when I receive feedback, because I know that's the only way that I can improve. Otherwise, I'm just harming myself, right? And I think that when you have players that are kind of showing that sort of attitude, like I don't even look at that and think like, wow, what assholes. I look at that and I'm like, someone needs to like get in there and like work on them with like mentality stuff. Like there has to be some kind of like whether it's a mental health coach or whether it's like a coach who's specifically there to focus on those that kind of thing, like their mentality of stuff, because when you're approaching anything that you want to be really good at, like arguably the single most important thing in actually getting there, regardless of what your natural talent is having the right mentality about it. Because like if you are either defeatist or the other end of the spectrum where you just refuse to take accountability, or you make excuses for everything that goes wrong, or you don't want to give up any of that power to let someone else help you, you're boned. And like that can extend to like things in people's personal lives, of course, so take that away, audience. But like that is one of the most like dangerous things that you can allow players to run away with, because the longer that goes on for, the more power they're going to feel like they hold, and the more that they're going to push that against like anyone who comes in to try and help them. And if they have like really big brands like the Players and Sentinels do, and therefore a super dedicated fan base, what are the odds that the organization's going to drop them for being stubborn? Like that's not going to happen, because they're just too big, they're too valuable. So then you just get in this weird bubble where like you're worshipped, but for something that you did like over a year ago, because you won't let anyone come in and help you like use all that potential that you literally have right there to do something even greater. And that's something that I think that I feel very passionately about, because like it's so difficult to watch people who are really fucking good at what they do throw that away because they are looking at things the wrong way. And I think a lot of the reason why I'm really passionate about it is because it's something that I have been so guilty of in my own life. And so I'm just like, don't fuck that up. Like, don't fuck it up, because like it's you will really, really regret it.
No, I can relate
yeah.
because if people don't know, one of the classic types of people fans think I'm overly critical of when I do CSGO desks is superstar players who play really badly in big matches because they're thinking, but he's a really good player. Like, why bag on him? Like, why not bag on the other guy in his team? It's like, because of exactly what Gio's saying. Like, I know from my own life what it's like if you have potential, but you sort of like, sometimes you can realise it and then sometimes you make the excuses and you just go like, whatever, people are holding me back or like, I'm better than they think. It's like, you will regret it. If you ever actually unlock any of it, you'll realise, fuck, I could have done this earlier. I could have been ahead of the game. Like, there's a million factors, of course. It's probably the most frustrating thing to see. Yeah, absolutely. So in the case of Sentinels, just as we said on some of the past episodes, the reason why we're always going to, not just because they're a big team, over-focus on them, it's because they've got all these incredible players. They've got all these players where the joke is you could take like 2 or 3 of these players, put them on other teams, and they could be the best player in their fucking role. So when they're all together, we expect the top. You're supposed to be going for the absolute top notch. You're not supposed to be coming last place in your region. There's a problem when that happens. So this is obviously a conversation we can spin out. We can have a much more abstract conversation. We can bring in some topical stuff. Because when you say that, actually, like the idea that like maybe you just even need someone to work on mentality. Maybe it's not like a guy comes in with the coach's hat on like, right, you're going to do that. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a person essentially to be like a star player whisperer, someone who he can get the buy-in from them. Essentially, by the way, this is where the obvious segue to me would be. This is exactly where you hire someone like Sean Gers, because that's someone where not only, listen, all you have to do is just do a broadcast. He clearly fucking knows the game. Secondly, he's very good at explaining it to the layman. That's the whole reason you fans like him. I know you all think you like him because, I agree, he's a G. You don't even know that, you idiot. You're some fucking idiot playing solo queue. Just trust me when I tell you that he knows that, right? And then the other thing is this, he's done it before. He's been in fucking major semi-finals in CSGO, like world championships on stage with like millions watching. Like, he doesn't give a fuck about some NA VCT online qualifier. Like, you can't be fucking zombs and turn to Sean Gers and go, but what do you really know about it? It's like, what do you know, little shitter from Overwatch? You never fucking even did anything. So the difference is someone like that immediately walk in the door. Status is there. You have to at least give a go. And by the way, here's the spoiler. When someone like that walks in the door, if you don't listen to him, if I'm your org, you're going to be the next on the chopping block, mate. That's the line in the sand I need. Because that tells me you'll never listen to anyone if you won't listen to someone like that. So to me, that's why actually that move, it really is the case. What Riot's loss is going to be 100 Thieves' gain, almost certainly, it seems to me. That must be a very eligible character. So, Peak, I know this is obviously right in your wheelhouse here. Where do you want to take this? Where do you want to go on this topic? Because I know it's bigger than just Sentinels, right? A lot of the teams, it seems like, don't have the coaches, staff, and we're not talking, by the way, just about a coach. We're talking about a staff, like the assistant coaches, analysts, like build it out, right?
Yeah. So, I can start with Sentinels. I wanted to chime in on this, but you took it right here.
It's all right.
So, if you like that person that works on them with the mentality and stuff, I feel like that's something that coach should be. Well, the head coach should be capable of, because it's sort of like a guy walking with a flashlight in the dark, and sometimes the flashlight doesn't work, and you have to. It's like a game where you have to switch light, or maybe take a bigger flashlight or something, and you have to find the right darkness to flash on in the players, and like that's how you get to them, and not
the right area to point to.
Yeah, area is right? What I mean. Like, not everyone is going to have the same area in the same location.
There you go. Right.
And like, if you take someone that's just stern, or there's someone that's just trash talking their players, sure, you can get like a certain distance with that. But if you want like the whole yard, like the whatever people say, that's when you get people like Sean Gers. Like, you need less in-game specific stuff and more out of the game, just leadership through and through. And then if you add on top of the in-game stuff, like if the head coach has that, that's perfect. But that's when you can add analysts, you can add assistant coaches. And in my opinion, like, assistant coaches are sort of like extensions. It's like the extra arm or the extra hand from the head coach. And then analysts are sort of like doing the inputs, or going through the data that otherwise would take way too much time, and the organization can't pay overtime for. So
I always give the analogy that if people saw the recent Dune movie, look, they didn't do a great job like explicating like what all the context was, because they were trying to compact the whole book in this case. It's going to be 2 movies, but there's a concept in the Dune universe which goes like this. In the concept of like their technology, they outlawed AI, right? Because AI, like Terminator style, rose up and had like a civil war with humans, right? So what they do is they outlaw the ability to ever make a machine that can think. So what happens instead is, because the tech did exist as machines before, people want to still get the benefits of what you could have gotten from the AI, right? So what they do is they have a class of human who essentially they're called mentats, and they're like this. They're an advisor where what they do is they train their mind through technique to take in all the data, and then the idea is they can sort of process things like, battlefield tactics, or like what a ruler should do with his resources, like, like oil, their version of oil or whatever, And the premise is, to me, that's what like the analysts are doing, dude. They're going and they're watching all the other regions. Like, for example, if you're an NA team right now, right, you're probably going to think like, what the fuck do we care about Korea? I would have my analysts watching the finals of this fucking VCT Korea, because for all you know, they might be slightly ahead of meta in one particular area. Maybe they've figured something out about how a comp's used or an area of the map that's OP. That's where, though, you wouldn't want to waste Shazam's time going and watching that demo, though, in case there's nothing in it. If you have the guy who's an analyst do that, the idea is he doesn't then have to explain it. He doesn't have to make the players buy in. He just feeds that to his coaches and they do the rest. That's why you can even have a coach. People to know this is the Korean system. The head coach in Korea isn't the wizard who knows the game. His whole job is that. He's the top of the structure. He takes the info. He keeps practices legit. And it's usually the people who in the West we'd have as the coach is usually like the strategic coach / the assistant coach, actually. So that just shows how, look, Korea has its own problems where they haven't gone other far. Like they don't actually believe in sports psychology, for example. But in certain areas, they clearly have sort of like nailed a structure, and by the way, it's found them a lot of success. So yeah, keep going, Peak.
Oh yeah, so I'm surprised to see that all these NA teams are spending so much money on the players and not really on the staff. And
yes.
I don't understand why it happens over and over and over in games. Like, for example, Overwatch, you had NRG coming in there, setting up the coaching staff. Okay, went like this and that, but then they got a Korean coach, bam, got to decide, okay, this is how I want to set up my coaching staff. And you're gonna, like, why do these organizations fumble the ball over and over when they know, okay, this is the formula, this is what works, just do this? Because you remove, okay, instead of these abilities in Overwatch, you have these abilities in Valorant, and everything else is pretty much the same. It, like, if we take an example, if you want to learn how to play the piano, it's no different than learning how to cook. If you remove the details, like the process of it repeating the same thing,
sure,
learning from the experience is the same thing. And yeah, why don't they set up a team? Because it's very cheap to just pay some analyst a minimum wage to look at VODs for a year, and then you have that whole database, you have all this information ready at hand, compared to if you need to pay someone last minute to fix it and deal with them being overloaded on stress. And you don't even know if your coaches can be overloaded on stress. And for example, if we take how I worked in Overwatch, I had 100 to 110 work weeks. Hour
work week, yeah.
Yeah, and that was not viable by any means.
No, you burn out easily, of course.
Yeah,
brutal.
And you're gonna see that in Valorant as well, especially if there's only one coach. And I feel like it's way too much power given to the players, or the GMs are just not really understanding why they need a coach, and they just want one because everyone else has. It's like an iPhone, and yeah, I don't think that they see the value, and I'm not sure if that's because there isn't enough coaches. And at that point, why don't teams do open trials for coaches? Because how will you get good talent if you don't announce, okay, we're looking for good talent? And yeah, it feels like too much teams are recruiting coaches through players. Okay, we want this buddy, and then you end up with G2,
yes,
who is switching out Mixwell, putting in Kellogg's. Now you sell Kellogg's, now you put in Mixwell, and you put him on the role that he lost his groove on, like Sentinel. It doesn't really make sense. And you shift in-game leadership, and all these problems that you can spot as an observer weeks ahead of time, they overreact. Like, well, you don't really spot them weeks ahead of time. You see them overreact to those problems like they are so grave, like they are so bad for the team, but somehow they didn't see them beforehand and didn't take action on beforehand. Because, for example, if you know that Mixwell is such a big issue for the team, why did you even put him in for 2 weeks for Kellogg's? And then why did you sell Kellogg's? Or how did 100 Thieves end up with switching the whole structure in the roster around? And then why do you get these 2 players from EU for no reason and then kick them off the 2 matches? Like, makes 0 sense. And the whole Valorant scene has to kind of grow up and do what 100 Thieves did with Sean Garrison DDK, and kind of give more power to the coaches so that they can set up a system that they believe in. But also you need competent people, and for that you don't really hire the snake oil sellers or the bodies, so to say.
Yeah.
And I think instead it's better to have a hiring process that's good, and that comes from even above, like where you have to do. I don't know. You have to set up the hiring process from.
He's got to have like a competent general manager, and he's got to know the space and who to hire and what type of players he's got. Yeah, of course. It applies to the whole team structure in some sense, yeah.
I do wonder if... I'm so sorry. I just wanted to jump in and say, like, I do wonder if, like, if Valorant were to ever become a franchise system, or even just have like a really robust rev share system, like if that's when we would then start to see more support staff. Because as it stands right now, like if you're an organization in Valorant, like I can understand why you'd want to spend all your money on big players, because they're big brands and more likely to make you money in the short term, right? And like because there isn't like because Valorant's such a fresh esport, like there isn't that kind of structure that like what we see in like League of Legends, for example, where that is a franchised system, and that, you know, they are getting like money for being there essentially. So their existence within like the tier 1 space isn't necessarily threatened and stuff like that. And I, you know, still in my time in esports haven't been able to like make up my mind where I stand on like franchise versus non-franchise, but that's kind of beside the point. Like I'm just trying to see it from the perspective of the people who own these teams that have no guarantee as to whether or not they're going to be there, and you've got to make money. Like, are you going to invest in like the long-term benefits of having support staff, which I'm with you, Peak, where I'm like, well, that's better for the long term of the team and the long-term success of the team. But the other side is like, are you going to invest in having like the big brand that can like make you fans and money now, and like your franchise players and stuff like that? You know, that's kind of why we have this situation with Sentinels where it's like everyone fucking loves tens, and Shazam. Doesn't fucking matter what happens with Sentinels. They can get first rounded. It doesn't matter. Like people, that no one's gonna waver on that. Like those players sell the brand to the audience. So like, why would they want to take power away from them? Like, why would their priority be getting a coach? Like, as someone who's in esports and like as someone who's an analyst and cares about that stuff, I can see where the viability, the benefits are for like bringing that on and focusing from that perspective. But if you're like you know, someone at the org who wants to be ensuring that your like brand is profitable in a game that doesn't have like that same structure in its esports circuit right now, like where are the dollar signs? And that's where they are.
One thing I would say is, like I said on one of the earlier episodes, unfortunately, it is a very, very common trend. I mean, Pete knows this. This was literally how the beginning of Overwatch was. It was loads of top players in the West who were really good at the time and had loose teams like fucking the team that was Envy, etc. And all they did was just say, like, to their owner, like, we don't really need a coach. Look, like, you know, that's for the other teams or whatever. And at the time, as long as their results held up, they were able to keep that sort of like delusion present in their mind. But spoiler, by the end, everyone breaks, because nobody can have permanently good results forever through all metas, through all player forms, dips, player moves. Eventually, you hit the team that just doesn't work. And eventually, even just from your org, it's going to be what they try next. Like, so one thing they haven't tried is get a coach. And as soon as you get the coach, no one ever goes back. You don't ever go back to like, well, this coach wasn't good, so we're just going to remove the concept of coaching. No, at that point, you get a competent coach. So the other problem that always annoys me, dude, is this. In the early days, because the players don't want coaches, therefore there aren't loads of coaches, they then go, well, who would we hire as a coach? Is that, yes, the first teams have to essentially experiment, and that's how we'll find out who the good coaches are. But spoiler, the reason why if you're Sentinels, you should want to try coaches out is because when everyone figures out who the good coaches are, you've got loads of money. You can just sign them, and then you've got the best coach. And in your particular case, maybe you're even right. Maybe with your particular stars, you want a very specific coach. You don't just want anyone. Maybe Peak wouldn't fit you, for example. But maybe you can find the coach that does fit your players that would get the buy-in. Because unfortunately, because they're spending so much money, a lot of the org owners will have a player or two. I would speculate it might be like Tens, Shazam in Sentinels. They might have a player or two where that player does have their ear. And if that player sort of tells them, like, look, either I don't need a coach or there just isn't one right now, then maybe they get to sort of get some extra time. but it never lasts. And all I'll say is this, is we even had this in Counter-Strike, where it was the same logic. Like, there was a couple of teams, most famously the Swedish Fnatic team was just so good. They would win with no coaches, or the joke is, they would have someone, it would just be like their former teammate who was their mate, was the coach behind, and maybe he just watched a demo, so he was sort of just playing like loosely the analyst role. But all you need to know is this, they were all talking a good game, but they didn't need coaches. Like, why would we win the game? They didn't need a sports psychologist. Famously, Olaf Meister just said, why would I need a sports psychologist? I don't choke. But you know what? The next year when Astralis came along and won all the majors and became the best team ever, because it was so famous that their coach had total control of their structure and even made the roster moves, everyone has a coach now. Because now it's like he said about the iPhone. It's not about whether you actually think it's a better phone. It's just that everyone's got it. So that's even another way you can fix it. So the sad thing actually about the Sentinels case is, if they actually got their coaching staff, it would almost ensure everyone else got them. They could actually be the leader in this regard and sort of fix the scene. Like, if they got a coaching staff now and became really good again with the same players, that's the advert right there. That's the power of coaching.
If you take a team like Fnatic, for example, now in Valorant, I wanted to mention it because when they came out, like they sort of asked me if I was ever interested in coaching, because I was talking with like, okay, I see if they want me as a content creator, and they asked, okay, what about coaching then? Because I've been coaching in Overwatch, and I saw that, okay, they put a lot of emphasis on coaching now, like early on, like we're talking 2 years ago, and you can see that, okay, when Boaster joined the team, he wasn't really this tense type. He wasn't mega huge, but then they bring in players and they have a way of, okay, they have a process of like bringing up the players, and then they become more famous. They become famous with the brand, and then they like snowball each other. And that's something that Sentinels could do, for example. But I feel like there's way too much lack of motivation to do your due diligence with okay, how do I want to teach new coaches, or how do I basically scout new coaches when I have no idea? And it's very easy and very low effort to just buy the best players and ask them, okay, who's a good player? Because Sentinels have done that in the past with other games as well. And I think it's just a running theme that they do that. They don't really innovate much. Whereas if you're Fnatic, you do innovate a bit and you take risks, and you don't bring these flashy players. And then look at Fnatic now. Boaster, super huge, super popular, and they are winning off that, and they can also switch them out whenever they want and do the same thing again. So like they will be benefiting from just learning how to set up that process. Every other team, I mean, will benefit from that.
By the way, one other thing I would also say as well is that I really misunderstood a point. This is why if it's your star player who's talking to the org, you're in trouble. Because another thing the star player will often do is they often, unfortunately, look, on the most basic level, they understand the premise of like, I get more resources, or I get like that set up to make my plays. I get my pick every time. They get that premise, right? But what they often don't get is that means other people are doing things to help them, right? So here's the mistake a lot of pros who are really skilled make, is maybe, even then I think it's debatable, but let's take his premise. Maybe he really doesn't need a coach. He's actually doing his role amazingly. But the point is, do you have perfect connection with your teammates? Do they understand how you're playing? Do you all procedurally know what you're doing? Maybe not. Maybe there's like a little bit of loose ends there, or maybe in the Sentinels example we gave before, it's like there's two people are working together and three people are working together, but the three and the two don't connect. That's where a coach can help you. Your coach can go and get your worst player or the player playing the trickiest role, and he can just work with that guy, and he can sort of fix that a little bit. He can connect you. Like, oh, there's so many things they can do. By the way, even just having a second set of eyes is sometimes useful. Just having another person you can trust that you know they're not going to leak information like your fellow other pros will, but you can just go back and forth with this guy and the pros and the cons and stuff. I think it's a mad underrated aspect. Like, the key thing is, I always draw it to my analogy for sports psychologists, because a lot of fans reductively think that you just get a sports psychologist and then you have the player that chokes talk to them. Now he does not choke, because no, it doesn't work that way. It's the same as the doctor. Not every doctor's amazing. Not every doctor's like the best at his job. There's a guy out there who's the worst heart surgeon ever, and a few people have probably died. So the point point is, you have to get the right one for you, obviously, and that fits your style, your personnel. And in this particular case, that's why I say on the Sentinels one, I'm giving them a slight out. I do think they have a very particular case where you don't just throw any coach in there. Like we were saying earlier, I actually think if they threw in someone who was just a nerd and had no experience as like a pro, I think that would be the guy who'd sink immediately, even if all the things he was saying were amazing. So for their team, it does feel like they need someone like a Sean Gers type figure. By the way, if you didn't know, Shazam was even fucking playing under Sean Gers in CSGO. So like that, those are the sort of ones where to me it's more of a slam dunk. So the reason I bring that example up is I'm just actually amazed people like 100 Thieves are just letting that move happen sort of in front of them. Like, dude, that was your guy. Like that should be who you were targeting. It's even the time to do it. So what about if we go to the specific 100 Thieves example then? What do you think of this move? So in 100 Thieves, what they've done is they've actually, this is also, by the way, amazing PR if you don't know, at exactly the time DDK and Sean Gers have retired from casting because independently they didn't get hired to some events. They picked up both of them. They put DDK in the general manager role, which in theory, assuming it's like sports, is going to be more like set up the total structure, maybe be involved in choosing who the coaches are, choose roster moves. Then they've got Sean Gers to be the coach itself, and then they've brought in Mike's as the assistant coach. So, Gio, maybe you start me off. What are your overall thoughts of this move for 100 Thieves? Because they were a team, again, that we've discussed heavily, and they were also a team that, like, they were just having issues even getting the roster together, right?
Yeah, I mean, 100 Thieves have had a lot of issues of late, and yeah, there's the whole thing about like them changing their roster so much in this stage. I think them hiring Sean, DDK, and Mike's is actually really good. So I think it's a good thing that they've brought in, regardless of whoever they are, the fact that they've brought in like 3 support staff at the same time so they can actually start to build and like consolidate this idea that they can grow from. I think that's definitely a really solid thing, especially for a team that seems to be lacking a kind of identity at the moment and almost needs a bit of a reset. So I definitely like that. I think that Sean, yes, will be a very valuable coach, and I agree that the whole thing with like a head coach has to also be somebody who can like be that guy who like in the most reductive way possible like will gas you up. You know, he has to be able to provide the mental side of things as well as being like smart at the game. But because of Sean's history in esports, not just Valorant of course, but notably Counter-Strike, like he is going to command that respect from players straight away. So you're probably not going to have a huge issue with like players wanting to like push back on that, or at least you shouldn't, because I think that of all people, Sean is going to be someone who does just naturally deserve that kind of respect from anyone who is working underneath him. I think that Dan seems like he would be incredibly competent at being a GM. Like it's interesting how many people in esports in the past who have gone from these sorts of roles into GMing and have done a great job of it. I mean, notably like Susie, Monty's wife, was a really good example of that, right? She's done so many different things in esports in the past.
Sure.
Been around for ages. She was in commentary for a long time, and then she went and became a GM and did from the outside anyway what seemed like a pretty good job of it. So I think that gives a really unique insight into the way that the industry just kind of is, and different people that Dan will have like met and come into contact with and seen their experiences and heard about their experiences is probably going to lend itself really well to him having a great like pool of knowledge from which he can draw and actually like pump into being a general manager. And I think the fact that Sean and Dan have like had this kind of joint product going on for a while, not just in their like casting, but they've made some content together and whatever, like that's going to have a really nice sort of cohesiveness within the team. And of course having an assistant coach as well, and Mike's has experience in Valorant, it's not like it's his first gig, you know, that leans into what we were talking about just a bit ago, where it's like you can have the head coach which focuses on like the more holistic ideas, and then an assistant coach who can focus on like more specifics, and you can bring in more of a like certain specific analytical ways of looking at the team as well. And I think working with Sean on that would be really awesome. Obviously the big question with 100 Thieves right now is, are they going to change the roster? I think the biggest rumor at the moment is that they may bring in Wardell, who's just been dropped by TSM, who, as much as I have like waxed lyrical about how I don't want 100 Thieves to constantly change their roster, I think that if Wardell were to replace Bang on the roster, and I'm actually quite a fan of Bang as a player, but I think if Wardell were to replace Bang on the roster, it almost allows a lot of those players to settle into roles that would really work for them. Ethan could go back to being the initiator, Wardell take on like the chamber kind of role, and he would be the opper. And then Asuna can really thrive in his role as a duelist, like with rifles. And I think that if we obviously don't know if that is or isn't going to happen, but if that were to happen, with all of this new support stuff, a much more settled idea of like who is playing in what roles and leaning into the strengths of those players could actually be a really, really promising reset for 100 Thieves that they have desperately needed for quite some time. I mean, arguably since Steel left the roster.
What do you think in general? You can pick any aspect of that you want, Peak, on the 100 Thieves, either, potentially who they might bring in as players, what do you think of the coaches are? What angle do you want to attack?
Well, I want to look at the DDK and Sean Garris first. I feel I completely agree with what Gio said, and to give my perspective on it, I feel like DDK and Sean Garris they are very high level in how you manage the team, how you work with players, how you understand players, and so on. Both of them really good knowledge. So it's not like DDK has more managerial stuff or the Sean Garris has less, and so on. I feel like DDK, when I hear him talk, he has a very good. He's like the right guy to pitch something to owners, for example. He's the right guy to have an 8-shot, understand everything, but also not really give him like ideas that he can latch onto that would be bad ideas, or maybe that are kind of sparking emotions that you don't want in an ownership. So you can get the right players that you want, or you can get the right assistant coaches, or basically sell the idea of what you want to do. And then with Sean Garris, I feel like he's the best guy to have dodge all these baits that not baits, but kind of jabs players will give you. It's sort of like when you have kittens, like they try to push the boundaries and see what they can get away with. And Sean Garris is like the right guy to not get tilted by players and doesn't really take these conversations.
Dude, I'll give you the best example. The analogy is, it's from actually the world of pickup. It's called a shit test. And guess what? You might not believe this, Gio, but sometimes when you meet a beautiful woman, she might test you to see if you actually are confident. You know, maybe you're full of shit. Maybe she pokes a hole in it, points something out like, oh, and the classic one, by the way, is just because I bet you say that to all the girls. So like, the point is, if you're the person who then sort of shyly looks at your feet and go, no, I don't really, but I just think like, you've lost already. Like you failed the shit test. That's what it was for. It was to test what you were made of. So players definitely do that all the time, by the way. Because the point of the shit,
I had you here to teach me about how to chat up beautiful women.
The point of the shit test, though, isn't, by the way, that the person, this is the part that people miss, though. It's actually not how it would be appeared. This is why if you don't know what it is, you'll fail, actually. It's not that the person isn't interested in you. They're trying to figure out who you are, though. They're trying to figure out, for example, like, do you actually believe what you're saying, or are you just, is this a facade? Will you just fold the second I push back at all? Players, especially star players, will do that all the time. Like, because what they're trying to test in the coach is things like, for example, the classic mistake a coach will make is a player might actually be amazing at one specific role in the game. So he'll just keep trying to lead you down examples that he always has the advantage experientially from. These are all like little pitfalls that are so easy to fall into, because if you start trying to battle him, and the whole premise is who knows more about this, he's picked his battleground there, whereas if you keep it bigger picture and stuff, see, yeah, I know what you mean, Peak. I'm just trying to sort of like explicate it a little bit there. And obviously, coach G on how to pick up hot women if she ever would want to do that,
I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah, so I feel like that's perfect for 100 Thieves, and I have no idea about Mike, but I've seen him on Twitter. He's kind of he reminds me of how I was a bit outspoken, like very aggressively on Twitter about teams doing this and this and that and that, and I feel like he's gonna be good and it's very nice to have Sean Garris be able to take that all good knowledge, but not risk losing it because of fights with players.
Yes,
and be able to also handle older players is really, really important, because you never know if you bring in a 20-year-old head coach, like how will they do with Eco, for example, and you will automatically lose discussions and then spend time on just doing nothing. So,
by the way, that's also low-key why it's a very smart move, because if people don't know, Sean Garris was Eco's in-game leader in CSGO. So that means I imagine he immediately has Eco's buy-in, which probably means the rest of the team to some degree,
I also just want to jump in and say, like, I didn't really mention like who Mike's is, but he was the coach of Envy that actually got Envy to qualify for Masters 3.
Oh, okay.
So he's like not just like a random guy who's like just landed his first big gig. Like he has worked with big teams before. I think back in First Strike, just looking at his Liquipedia. He was back on G2, but I don't really know much about what he was doing back then. But I was on an episode of Valoranting with him once, just after Masters 3. So he's a really interesting guy, like, and seems very competent. As I say, got Envy to get to that point. I don't remember why he left the roster. I guess they just did some changes. But yeah, so he's actually like an experienced guy. So bringing that in, the fact that he's worked with top, Valorant teams in the past before, I think also just provides that extra layer of experience that 100 Thieves can really derive and pump into value.
By the way, what did you think? Obviously, she was just speculating there as a potential move. What would you think if Wardell was to join 100 Thieves Peak? Is it a good move?
I think it would be really good because he brings the energy they kind of need now, because they have like when I've been watching their streams, especially after they released those 2 EU players. I forgot the names, but it doesn't matter. So they kind of look fragile, if that makes sense. And they really need someone like Wardell who can just pump them up. And he also comes from a background where he kind of has to be that guy for TSM. And I feel like it's perfect for them. And he's definitely capable of winning games. He's capable of playing Jet and also Chamber. And I feel like the guy is definitely down to show that he doesn't need to be in TSM to be successful. And that energy that he can bring can be a very good ramp for more success in the snowball, and kind of give the whole new staff a chance, to give the whole new structure a chance. Because Hiko also said recently, after Sean Garrison DDK joined, that he kind of doesn't know where the org wants to take the roster. They don't know who is keeping the job, and there could be a lot of insecurity, also worries there, but they want to try and give it a chance and go in with an open mind. And to do that, you kind of need to set aside the fear of losing your job, but also fear of unknown, and roll with the punches. And you don't really have much control, whereas before you maybe try to take control, especially when you were switching roles, and it kind of felt like the players did called the shots themselves there, basically. So yeah, I feel like it would be a good move for them.
A little bit of insight for people on Wardell, because Wardell is actually a very interesting case of a player who basically was going to make it to the top tier in CSGO, but he just left to Valorant. Because what happened was, he used to play in the team that Steel was in once upon a time. That was his in-game leader. And then when we came to 2020, actually in the, like, I was doing Flashpoint, which essentially at that point in time was like tier 2 Counter-Strikes. We didn't have the biggest teams. A lot of the NA teams were included in this, and he was like one of the main pop-off players. And the way he played, though, was a very unique style of AWPing, though, which was normally an AWPer typically is like mildly conservative, because it's a weapon it's so easy to get instantly killed with. You miss, you lose your position. It's a very expensive weapon in the economy. He was basically the most high-feet AWPer you could ever get. Like, he would very aggressively peak constantly, like put himself into terrible situations that he had to like use really good mechanics to get out of. And so even though he essentially, like, put it this way, he was the guy who would buy the glass cannon AWP, which is where you buy the AWP and no armor, which you almost never do in Counter-Strike. He would do that like semi-regularly. So he was a guy who obviously had an incredible amount of confidence in his raw ability, basically just to kill the opponent, even if maybe strategically he wasn't making the smartest choices. And it was basically intimated, if people know the time period, which is just months after this, when Nitro left Team Liquid, he was their AWPer and went to Valorant. That basically, Stewie2K basically suggested we would have just recruited Wardell. Problem is, he's already in bloody Valorant. So like at that point, he just never got his shot. So I was actually interested to what was going to happen to him in Valorant, because spoiler, if he failed, I would sort of be like, you fucked it up, mate. You actually had your chance. The difference is, if people don't know, people like Som and Tens, like, they had like a brief chance where they were at the level I'm talking about Verdell could have been at, but then they were there for a little while and then they went away and they hadn't made it yet, you know. This guy actually looked like he was going to be one of the next really good players. So I'm interested to see. It sounds like he's being put in a potentially a similar position in Valorant.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Wardell is that, as far as I'm aware, for this in the entire 2022 so far, he's only played Chamber. And the interesting thing about Chamber is it means that it frees up the Jet role for someone else. And Chamber you can play just as that Oppa. I mean, his you
can get more firepower in your comp, basically, right?
So yeah, you can kind of be you can play it aggressively if you want, but you can also be that backline sort of duelist role, so to speak. Chamber's not a duelist, but some people like to play him like that. And the interesting thing about him being on 100 Thieves is one of the problems that Hiko spoke about with the roster and the roles in 100 Thieves is that, Asuna being, basically he was saying that we don't have anyone who wants to be an Oppa. Asuna has to take the role a lot of the time because he's the Jet player, but that's not really Asuna's strength. Asuna is really a give him a Vandal and tell him to go into battle kind of guy. And so if they brought in somebody like Wardell, it would allow them to have that role kind of filled, as that guy who's going to be the Oppa for the team. Let Asuna play to his strength. And the other interesting thing about it is that since Bang and JC Stani came into the team, the Chamber role has actually been juggled around by a couple of the different players. So we've seen JC Stani play it on a couple of maps. We've seen Ethan play it on a couple of maps, whatever. And so that all came into part of that whole roster role reshuffle that they kind of had on the team. And so if you've got one guy who's going to sit and actually take that role solidly, it means that some of those other people can kind of go back to their other roles. So this is why I say of the two new players, it would more likely be Bang to be replaced because JC Stani mostly plays smokes and there is not really much of a reason to replace the guy who plays smokes, but at least not for this reason. If they wanted to get rid of him for something else, then that's whatever. But the thing with Bang is even though he's a good player, it means that Ethan could play flex again because that's what Bang has been playing. So Ethan could return to flex, free up that role that then Wardell could play this Oppa, have Asuna do what he does best, and then you'd probably see Hiko go back to what he wants to play and actually be more on the Sova. JC Stani, assuming we keep him, he's going to be the smoker. So I feel it would kind of play into what, at least what Hiko has expressed that 100 Thieves really need, while not necessarily needing the roster to be blown up again, and I think that would be a very interesting thing to see how that goes because for me, I think Asuna is an incredibly talented player, and he was a really, really big talking point towards the end of 2021. And the fact that he hasn't really been someone who's been in those conversations up with players like Ye and Leaf, I think is a testament to a lot of these sort of role issues that 100 Thieves have had. And if you can bring in that guy who cool, there's an agent that's basically been designed for you to play, and you can just sit there opping to your heart's content because no one else on the team wants to fucking do it. That almost seems like a perfect marriage in a sense.
Sure. Right, I thought the last big topic we'll talk about is, it's pretty big news, is that if people don't know, the reigning world champions have said they've just kicked their in-game leader, who, if you remember on the episode of Sideshow, that was actually who they were picking. Sideshow and Gio had this guy as maybe the best in the world at his job. So there's two interesting angles here. One, they've effectively done what I'm saying Sentinel should do. You've got to make the big move after you just bottom out completely when you're supposed to be the best. So there's that, which is what did they do in Ascend. And interestingly enough, actually, Peak linked me to where the head of esports for Ascend has written a whole thread about the reasons why they've done this, etc. And then the other angle to me, obviously, then is if he's really good at his role, but they obviously think he's not a fit for their team. What do you think he does? Where does he go now? What do they do? So, Peak, maybe start me off. Which angle do you want to go with first? Go with the Ascend part first, maybe.
We can take a bone call first.
Go on.
Yeah, and then I'll switch briefly to Ascend, and we can go back to bone call because that's a very open-ended thing. So I don't know which part of the whole deal is okay, we want to play to our strengths or we want to play the meta, because that's kind of what it feels like. It could also be that we want to play to our strengths, but we identify different strengths. And I'll assume it's that one, because I hardly think...
different visions of the game, basically.
Yeah, basically different visions. And I think the one that would benefit a lot would be G2, and have him be the in-game leader for them, because he's a Finnish player, if I'm not wrong. He is very leveled in how he talks, and also just emotions-wise, very common for Finnish people in general.
Stereotypical, yes.
Yeah, and the last thing you need for G2 is up and down volatility and volcano explosions. So I would send them there, or just any team that really needs stability and consistency, and also just very a player who's very easy to that's very able to handle stress and tough situations, because he sounds like a guy that's able to handle egos, that's able to work with new players and kind of mesh a lot of different cultures. And when you have different cultures like in Ascend, you need to solve problems in a unified way, and not just in your way or in two different ways. For example, like I bet you that Turkish players address discussions and different indifferences in the discussions different than Finnish people do.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah. So I would send him to G2 or maybe even any teams. I would pick him up as an any team as well. But I think that he would thrive better in EU, because in NA, if you go to NA and you have to be a minority there as well because of in Portugal, you kind of get overruled by the culture, and it can be very difficult to build up the culture from down below. So you would almost need an EU coach as well if you get sent to NA. Then for Ascend, I think this is the right move. Like, this is what the G2, for example, should be doing. This is like just a very standard, normal move, I feel like, where they understand, okay, this is our issue. We have seen this coming, and we know that our strengths are like this and that. And because we don't see it the same way, we will face blockades. Instead of just pushing through those blockades and like maybe making it through, or maybe find the right key for the keyhole, just get the right key for the keyhole now, and then see how that goes and like develop that. So for them, I think they're just making a good business decision. And for the player that they can bring in, that I think they might want someone who is easy to mold, and that would be someone who's not very that doesn't have like a big ego, so to say, that is very easy to work with. And you don't want someone that needs to be the center of attention, or someone that feels like, oh, I can't be replaced, because that's when you stop losing the ability to mold them. And Ascend, they kind of want to be a team that is able to do everything anytime, basically, in game.
Okay.
I'm curious to know if Ascend have already got an idea of who they want, just like given how, like, with how much certainty this decision has been made, because they are like the World Championship team, and Bone Cold individually is such an amazing player. Obviously in the thread that Crimson wrote, I just have it up here, he doesn't actually like specify what the difference in like philosophy was that led to this decision, which obviously I wouldn't necessarily expect him to say that, but obviously that kind of leads you to think that whoever they do pick up, most importantly, has to be someone that fits with that philosophy. But obviously, because we don't know what that is, like, we can't necessarily say. I'm curious about where Bone Cold's going to go, because, and this is something that I actually wanted to bring up in the episode we did last week when we were talking about IGLs, but there just wasn't a good moment to bring it up, is that if you have a look at the top teams in NA, most of the IGLs are controllers, but in EU, there's actually a lot of variety in what roles the IGL takes. So, for example, you can look on something like Team Liquid, where you've got Yampi, who's, you know, historically been a duelist. And so he's playing a lot of like that entry, and he's their IGL. And then Bone Cold, while he's shown flexibility across roles, like, you know, he plays a lot of Sova, for example. So, like, is it going to be as easy to put him into, let's say, G2 is what you were saying, Pig? Like, that means he would have to replace, either he would have to replace Mixwell, who's a duelist, or he would have to replace, like, someone who's playing like the role that he wants to be playing. So, like, you know, let's say either Hoodie or Meadow or maybe a Vova, and get rid of them and then just hand over the reins to Bone Cold, right? So I think that there's like that extra layer of like consideration for what team would be a good fit for him because of that, because it's not quite as meshy in Europe in terms of like, oh, I'm an IGL, therefore I'm most likely to be this role, therefore it's really easy to like switch IGLs out between teams and keep them all in the same role without making a ton of changes. I think that's an extra consideration that has to be made if he is to stay in EU. You know, I think a team that could be an interesting one to see him go to would be a team like Big, for example, because their IGL, Gob, he is playing that same role. He is a Sova guy. But then the thing that you have to consider with that is, you know, Big are in like promos now. Like they're essentially facing relegation. So are they a big enough team for A, to pick him up and for him to want to go to if they're already facing like not making it into stage 2?
Would the premise there be to actually replace Gob B?
Yeah, that would be my assumption, right? It's because he is currently that IGL and he's sat in like the same sort of role. So it's not that I think like you definitely have to get rid of the IGL in a certain team because you're replacing with an IGL, but it's like you know, that's something that's worth considering, because if you're not switching the IGLs out 1 for 1, then you've got to get rid of someone else on the team who might actually be perfectly good at their job. And it just so happens they have the same role as Bone Cold. So yeah, I'm curious to see like where that's going to go, just from that perspective on like how the roles sit with.
Because the only thing is, I will say, like, you're obviously doing it like Football Manager style. This is what I would do trade for trade. Just politically, the problem with that specific example is God B, basically, in CSGO, is the reason why Big is known as a team. Because even though he was one of the great in-game leaders, have been in much bigger teams. He used to be like Mouse Sports, etc. He sort of went, and that was like a German team that they built, and he's supposedly like super embedded with like the family of people who own this team. And it's like a team where in CSGO, basically, if you join that team, it's more that you want to play with those people, or you're German, and and there's people who've shown loyalty to that team, like where they could have gone to like FaZe Clan in CSGO, which is like way bigger team. So unfortunately, I do suspect that like he is like their son in a way. So it's not that he couldn't be removed. It's just I think it'd be pretty drastic if they did, you know.
It would be interesting though, because they have 2 Finns on that team. Like they've got Casper, who's actually on the team, and then their coach is Finnish as well. So just how Peak was talking about how like you know, you specifically brought up the fact that he was Finnish and how that could have a like an impact on where he would potentially go and the cultures and stuff, is like removing like that political side. And obviously, like, admittedly, I don't know a ton about like the CS history with a number of these players, but like removing that political side of things, like that would actually be kind of an interesting mix to you know, being able to be on a team with other Finnish players.
And also some of the other players are German, so in general, you probably do want a fairly chilled out fucking IGL who's just going to make logical reads. Again, if we know the stereotypes, they exist for a reason, by the way. I've been in esports long enough. Put it this way, there's a reason why I have all those Twitter reports. It's like, you know, in Germany, you'll know this, you know, in Germany specifically, if someone reports you, right, they have to send you an email that says someone from Germany has reported you, because they have like different rules about like hate speech or something. So the joke is like, there's always the fucking reports in my email that are like, as though I've said some like outrageous thing. And then when you go and look at the tweet, it's just like this player's shit or something, and some German guy's like, this is hate speech, I will report this and get him off the internet. It's like, listen, Germany, that ain't the way it works, thankfully. You ain't running the game right now. So okay, what about this topic then? What I want to ask is this: what is the actual future for Ascend then? Because listen, when you hear that statement, like I said at the beginning, like the reigning world champions, not only are in deep shit right now, but they're changing essentially the whole structure of their team potentially. Like, is this a team where in the current meta, would they if they'd have stuck with what they had, would they have just been fucked? Would they not have made it to the finals at the end of the year? Like, do they need, is it more than just the IGL change, do you think they need? Are the players themselves, is the rest of the roster good enough?
Do you want to take it first, Joe, or should I?
No, you go for it.
All right, so let me bring up Ascend here. I don't know if they will keep Zeke, because well, they will keep him, but I don't know if they will actively compete with him. It depends on when he is back, because he's recovering from some trouble with mental issues and mental health.
Right.
Not mental issues, mental health. Yeah, whatever you say.
Yeah, something happened.
So like that has to take the time it takes, right? And they can't go with substitution, so maybe they will have an extra that they can sort of replicate Zeke with, if that makes sense. And I think the core that Crimson mentioned, the 3 players that are left, they will work around that, and they will work with the system that they already have. That's basically what we get told from the reasoning that they have there, that they don't want to set a new thing, they don't want to create anything new, so they will just slot in the same type of players. And that's I don't think they would have gotten to Masters or Champions with the same squad that they haven't or had before, because obviously issues. And I think the formula instead is what will get them there. You kind of have to treat the next the next qualifiers like it's the first one, because if you treat it like, oh, it's the last chance, you kind of set yourself up for a bit of failure. And it's not like you're gonna do new things that you wouldn't do in the first one if you had the same amount of information. So I think they will have a good chance, even if it's the second one or third one or whatever qualifier it is.
Yeah, I don't see Ascend like really falling off the wagon. Obviously, whatever's going on with Zeke, like that's going to take time, and once he's kind of back on form is going to be a big thing. And I will be interested to keep an eye on that, because Zeke was a player on Ascend who during this stage I had a little bit of criticism for, like not because he was playing awfully, but I felt like I think I mentioned this on the episode where Sideshow was on, but I felt like his way of playing KO compared to what we saw in NA just wasn't quite up to scratch in the same way. And that in a lot of stage one has been a really big part of success. It's like how good is your KO supporting the rest of the team. The problem with like Ascend that they've always kind of struggled with is this idea that if CNED's having a good day, they're going to do great. And if CNED's not having a good day, then they're not going to do as great. And so I think consistency for him has been like a big thing that they've had to focus on. And of course, like if there is a role in that team that really has to be supporting the role that CNED is playing and it's not being done as well, then you are going to see issues. So I think that can explain some of what has maybe been going on with Ascend. But yeah, it is I think the players, the core of the players, CNED, Killers, and Starzo, are all very, very good players. None of them are anyone that I really have any complaints or real concerns about. But given that Bone Cold not only was IGLing, but as a player, a very good player. Like a lot of his personal decision making was really good, and the way that he played was great. Like not only are they going to have to find somebody who can live up to whatever this philosophy in game is that the rest of the team have, but also someone whose personal contributions to the team are going to be on an equal standing, I think, because when you have a team that in the past has had issues with being too reliant on your duelist's performance, you do have to ensure that like your supportive players are really pulling their weight, and that is something that Bone Cold was very good at doing. So it does put quite a bit of pressure on whoever this new player is. I don't have massive concerns for Ascend. I think that the team seems to be well managed, and you know, even like throughout stage 3 of last year or whatever, like they had some wavering and they still pulled through and they had some pretty good performance and whatever. And if you look over the course of their history, they've had a pretty decent history, even when like they had changes, you know, like the switch of Coldamenta and Zeke being a big one. So I'm not like super concerned, but I think this will be a bump in the road for them, that like as with any team that makes a change that is pretty core to who they are and their identity and the way they play, and of course having a player who's essentially having an illness at the moment, that's of course going to put you in a bit of a trough. But I don't think it's going to be a massive blip on the sort of the holistic view of their existence.
Peak, who is a player, maybe one we haven't talked about, who is really underrated? Who would you like to highlight at the end of this episode? Pick me a player, so if someone's a newer fan or maybe they only know the big names, who's someone they should look out for that's got a bit of nuance, a bit like, you know, classically in Overwatch it would often be like, you know, a fucking off tank or something that the fan doesn't look at when the game's going. Who would you pick out who's like underrated?
Hoodie from G2. The guy has been in very awkward situations with the team where, okay, we're switching game leader, we do this, and we play a strat that we copied from NA the night before. And like the guy is still fragging out really hard, and he always does that, and he's always consistent. And it looks like he's unfazed by these changes. And it really takes a lot from a player to have that focus, but also be able to deliver the same type of results all the time, and be a pillar for the team, especially when you're new to the team. So I think he's not getting the recognition he should be getting.
Do you have any thoughts on this player, Gio?
Yeah, I think Hoodie was a player who I especially really enjoyed during like the peak of the Sky meta. I thought he was a really good Sky player.
Right.
He's always been a very good like supportive initiator, and as I've mentioned a number of times, I love looking at the initiator players because that's the role I find the most interesting. I think he's someone who, when like, you know, if G2 are making a play that's sort of based around other people's utility or what other people are doing, like he can be kind of playing on his own, doing his, I don't know, if you're doing like a split push onto a site, for example, like you can always rely on him to be using his utility well to support everybody else and let them shine, while also kind of being self-sustaining, you know, like he's a good gun player as well. But yeah, I think he's a lot of fun to look at, and especially with all of the changes that have happened with their dual lists and kind of the issues that may lie there, you know, whether you're a Mixwell fan or a Kellogg's fan or whatever you think about what's going on there, Hoodie has been a consistent force kind of holding up whatever is going in that part of the team. So I would agree. I think he's a good shout.
This video was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Thooorin, William Peyton Lacy, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Find out who the upcoming guests are? Maybe you want to take part in a lengthy donated discussion with me? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skilluminati today. Where? Via the Patreon link in the description box.